The miracle doctor won't be a kept man. My heart belongs ashore. Chapter 561. That's impossible. How could anyone spend that much money on tea? Bianca refused to believe that such an expensive gift had come from Kiran. He was a loser, not Lord of the Sea. How could he possibly obtain such top-grade tea? My dear niece, you have no idea, Lindy groaned. It's not about money, but about tea that we ordinary people will never ever get to taste. Never. She gazed at the crushed tea leaves and stamped her foot in great sorrow. What? Lucia exclaimed, the reality of the situation finally dawning on her. She hurried over and pushed Lindy away. Stop talking and pack it up. Don't let it go to waste. If 50 grams could be sold for $1 million, the amount she had would be worth a few million. Even as scraps, they would be valuable. Archie could feel his blood pressure rising as he glared at his wife. Had she finally decided to cherish the leaves now? However, his anger was soon replaced by happiness. He was right to believe that Kiran was a promising and accomplished young man. The other man, who had been silent all this time, emerged from the kitchen with the trash can in his hands. He looked at Lucia, who was kneeling on the floor collecting the tea leaves. Lucia, were you the one who threw this away? He was Lindy's husband, Ben. Lucia nodded and said, Yeah, what's wrong? Crash! Ben hurled the trash can to the ground in a fit of fury. Seriously, how much more wasteful can you get? Wasteful? Lucia was already miserable, and her brother-in-law's rebuke only infuriated her more. What are you talking about? These are the roots of top-grade wild ginseng. Each root is a miracle herb that can nourish the body. I can't believe you actually threw them away. Well, what did you say? Thump. Lucia sank onto the floor, dumbfounded. Both her golden tea leaves and million-dollar wild ginseng were gone. Her heart hurt so much that she felt like it was going to bleed. What about my beef stew? She whispered. Beef stew? Ben sniffed the aroma wafting in the air and ran back to the kitchen. When he saw the gravy boiling in the pot and smelled the strong scent of ginseng, he almost exploded with rage. What a terrible waste. Using a life-saving herb like this in beef stew is simply a waste of natural resources. Your family has thrown away 2 treasures just like that. If you had sold them, they would have fetched you more money than your entire year's salary. Ben, being a doctor, was familiar with herbs, and he was utterly dismayed. Dazed by the shock, Lucia sat in place and mumbled, This can't be true. This can't be true. Bianca was incredulous. How could a poor dude have given gifts like these? Are you doubting our judgment? Ben and Lindy demanded in unison. Ben lowered his head and looked at the precious ginseng roots and tea leaves. Since all of this is just trash to you, we'll take them. He bent down to collect them. Don't touch them! They belong to our family! Lucia quickly stopped him, her gaze falling on the tea leaves that were already mixed with the trash. Right now, they sparkled like gold to her. How could she throw them away? She began picking them out with utmost care. The Campbell family descended into chaos as they commenced their rescue of the tea and ginseng. Despite Archie's distress, he was glad. Kiran had not let him down, and he was full of expectations for Kiran's future. Meanwhile, Kiran arrived at the Sutton family's residence. The setting sun painted the sky red, signaling the approach of nightfall. All the lights in the Sutton family manor were lit, adding a mysterious allure to the nightscape. However, this mysterious beauty was shattered by a piercing scream that sent shivers down one's spine. Ruth was hiding near the entrance, waiting for Kiran. When she spotted him, she rushed toward him, wailing, Mr. York, help! Kiran caught her, feeling her body shake like a leaf in his arms. When she had regained her composure slightly, she said, We need to go up the hill. Without a word, Kiran held her and sprinted up the hill behind the manor. He saw many bodyguards on the way. Some were lying on the ground injured, some were dead, and some were clutching their weapons with fearful expressions on their faces. They were more nervous and frightened than when Kiran had seen them during the day. Once Ruth had composed herself completely in his arms, she blushed and said, After you left today, Father Larson used the evil-repelling talisman on my mom and made her drink light holy water. Everything seemed normal at first, but after drinking the light holy water, Mom suddenly woke up and started attacking everyone she saw, as if she were possessed. No one dared to approach her at first. When my uncle tried, she slapped him so hard that his cheekbones were deformed. The bodyguards tried to restrain her. Those who reacted in time were injured, while those who didn't ended up dead. She fought like a martial arts master, not like a normal person at all. I was the only exception. When I showed up, she avoided me, or else she'd have killed Dad too. I was afraid that if I stayed here, she'd start killing people outside, so I went to the entrance to wait for you. Ruth's account confirmed Kiran's suspicions. You have a talisman on you. That's why she's afraid. Is it really that effective? Ruth asked, still curious. I drew it with my own blood. Of course, evil spirits are afraid of it, Kiran explained briefly, then asked, Where's Father Larson? When Mom started acting weird, all he did was hide nearby and throw all kinds of talismans at her. He was just like a clown. He had no idea what he was doing, and none of his methods worked. Seemingly triggered by the mention of Father Larson, Ruth belittled him mercilessly. Kiran made no comment as they reached the hill. In the distance, he saw more than 20 bodyguards cautiously advancing toward the hill with blast-proof shields. Their movements were slow and cautious, as if they feared being attacked. The ground was littered with casualties, forming a tragic scene. Some had even had their hearts ripped out. Gordon stood among them, covered in blood, his face pale and his eyes wide with distress. Please, try not to shoot or harm Mrs. Sutton. He truly loved his wife. Even though she had become a demonic creature, he still couldn't bear to hurt her. Dad, Mr. York's here, Ruth shouted. Dr. York, please help. Gordon spun around and made a desperate plea to the man who could be their savior. But before Kiran could respond, Gordon continued, I underestimated your abilities earlier. I was wrong. Please, Dr. York, have mercy and save my family. His voice was choked with regret and self-loathing. Kiran remained silent, and Gordon's panic intensified. Chapter 562. Smack! Gordon raised his hand and slapped himself twice. Please save her first, Dr. York. I'm willing to accept any punishment from you afterward. Thump! He threw himself onto his knees before Kiran. Right now, he knew very well that the Sutton family was facing an existential crisis. If his wife really got out and wreaked havoc, he would never be able to redeem himself in the eyes of the people of Fawkes. What was worse, his entire family would die. Still, he could not bring himself to make the decision to kill his wife. Caught between a rock and a hard place, he placed all his hope in Kiran. Ruth was mortified to see her father on his knees while she was in Kiran's arms. Hastily, she put her feet down and made to kneel as well. Kiran stepped forward and helped Gordon up. Please don't say that, Mr. Sutton. He glanced at Ruth. I'm not mad at all, or else I wouldn't have come here the moment I received her call. Don't worry, I can solve this. Dr. York, I believe my wife's suffering from a psychosomatic illness, Gordon informed him. I know. Kiran's gaze shifted to the top of the hill. I'll make sure your family reunites safely. If you can save my wife, I'll pledge my allegiance to you. From now on, all your problems will be my problems too, Gordon vowed vehemently. When Ruth heard this, she felt a pang of reluctance and dismay. What about her relationship with Kiran? She had enjoyed the warmth and safety of Kiran's arms. She wanted to be held by him and never be separated for the rest of her life. Kiran was pleasantly surprised by Gordon's seriousness. I'll be back with good news very soon, Mr. Sutton. He began to trudge up the hill. It was not long before the sound of fighting was heard. Kiran picked up his pace. Soon, he saw a woman in a flimsy nightgown, her face smeared with blood, battling several bodyguards. Just now, Gordon had led only part of his bodyguard team while the rest had gone ahead. To the bold ones, this was an opportunity to show what they could do. However, the seemingly weak woman displayed no fear in the face of the bodyguards. She attacked with simple punches and kicks, but there was no limit to her strength. She seemed insusceptible to pain and was not afraid of getting injured. Kiran's eyes narrowed slightly. This woman must be Gordon's wife, Mrs. Sutton. Mrs. Sutton's face was waxen. The dark energy had penetrated her body deeply, making her lose all consciousness. Boom! Suddenly, a deafening noise was heard. Eyes bloodshot, Mrs. Sutton sent the bodyguard in front of her flying with a punch. Whoosh! She spun round and appeared before another bodyguard. The bodyguard rushed forward fearlessly to subdue her, but she countered by grabbing his arm and yanking on it. With a snap, the limb separated from the body in a spray of blood. Ah! The bodyguard let out a shrill scream and keeled over. Bam! 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 Whirling around again, Mrs. Sutton knocked all the other bodyguards to the ground. Her power was immeasurable. When Kiran was about to enter the fray, a voice boomed beside him. Begone, demon! Father Larson threw several talismans at Mrs. Sutton. With a crackle, they burst into flames that threatened to devour her. Hellfire! Father Larson roared, his confidence boosted by the visible flames. Mrs. Sutton's expression became blank, and she stood in place unresponsively. Steve and the socialites emerged from the bushes, caked in grime and shouting joyfully, All hail Father Larson, supreme demon slayer and God incarnate. Steve's cries immediately spurred a series of flattering whoops. Under the applause, Father Larson grew more conceited. His fear of Mrs. Sutton disappeared and was replaced by confidence. He lifted his sprinkler high like a deity who had descended into the mortal world, pointed it at Mrs. Sutton, and declared loudly, Surrender, evil creature! He swung the sprinkler wildly. The fibers stood upright like steel needles, exuding a mighty aura that seemed to be able to kill demons with ease. A sluggish Mrs. Sutton remained frozen, staring vacantly at the sprinkler's onslaught. A relieved smile broke out on Father Larson's face. However, Kiran shook his head. Wham! Mrs. Sutton's fist rammed into the sprinkler with a bang. Crack! It was the sound of the sprinkler breaking. The inertia of the attack propelled Father Larson toward Mrs. Sutton. She dashed forward and punched him in the chest. Blarg! Father Larson spat out a mouthful of blood. Before his body could fly backward, Mrs. Sutton seized his right arm and jerked it toward her. With a snap, Father Larson's limb was torn off too. His robes were covered in blood, his features contorted with agony. Ignoring the pain, he scrambled to the side. Mrs. Sutton stepped forward, raised her right foot, and stomped on his chest. Father Larson hurled out the cross in his other hand. It hit Mrs. Sutton's leg before shattering into pieces, successfully disrupting her momentum. Father Larson quickly rolled away to make his escape. Without giving him time to stabilize himself, Mrs. Sutton drew near him like a phantom and reached out to grab his throat. Holy cow! Father Larson cried out instinctively and rolled away again, but not in time to prevent her nails from leaving bloody scratches on his body. Although he had managed to survive, he was battered and exhausted. No longer caring about his image, he scrambled to his feet and fled. He darted a glance at Steve and the others, and to his credit screamed a warning, "She's out of control! Run for—" Bam! Before he could finish, Mrs. Sutton's foot collided with his butt with the force of a high-speed train, sending him tumbling down the hill. Father Larson could not be bothered to shield himself or fight for purchase. Rolling down was a faster way to escape. Pride was the last thing he needed now. Nothing was more important than staying alive. Unfortunately, he did not go far before Mrs. Sutton caught up with him. She kicked him twice and tossed him back up the hill again. Father Larson felt like a ball being tortured by Mrs. Sutton. When he landed on the ground, he was already barely breathing. If not for his past training, he might have died from all this violent beating. Finally, Steve and the others snapped out of their shock and shrieked, "Oh my God! Run! She's possessed!" At this moment, Gordon and Ruth arrived, only to be greeted by a scene that horrified him. Ruth swung around to Kiran beseechingly. "Time's up, brat!" Kiran sauntered forward with his hands behind his back, his expression haughty. Chapter 563. "Kiran, be careful," Ruth reminded him apprehensively. Her mother had become so strong that it was terrifying. She feared for her mother's and Kiran's safety. When Steve noticed Kiran, he recalled the latter's previous words. Instead of thanking and warning him, he snarled, "It's all thanks to this punk's curse! Kill him, sis!" He shouted at a senseless Mrs. Sutton, hoping she would take out Kiran with one blow. Kiran almost burst out laughing. Was Steve a blockhead? Was he really trying to order an evil spirit around? When Kiran did not move, Steve grinned, thinking he was scared stiff. "You're gonna die really soon!" Father Larson's miserable state infuriated the ladies who had intended to give their bodies to him. How could Kiran still be standing there unharmed? Anger arose from deep within them. "Brat, do you really think you're stronger than the bodyguards and Father Larson? If Father Larson's exorcism didn't work, what makes you think your medical skills will? Stop being pretentious and seeking attention. You might trigger Mrs. Sutton into attacking us." They lobbed all sorts of mocking insults at him. The next moment, however, their mouths fell open soundlessly. Their eyes were wide with disbelief, too shocked to utter a word. When Kiran stepped forward, Mrs. Sutton turned tail and fled. Who was the evil spirit here? How could an evil spirit be scared of a human? "You have nowhere to run, demon!" Amid everyone's stunned silence, a voice suddenly bellowed from behind. All eyes shifted toward the sound. They saw a bearded man with a round face and big eyes flying through the air behind Kiran. "Ooh!" Everyone exhaled in relief. And here I thought this poser was the one who scared my sister off. It turns out the real master's behind him. Steve eyed Kiran contemptuously. I knew he couldn't possibly be that strong. If he was, he'd have done something already. What a shameless youngster. The socialites jeered at Kiran as they began smoothing out their messy clothes, glancing up at the person who had appeared out of the air. Kiran had initially meant to take action, but stopped when he heard the person's roar. Gordon and Ruth turned to look with curiosity in their eyes. The bearded man stopped before them and silently landed on the ground. His billowing clothes gradually fell back into place like a deflated balloon. At the same time, he exuded a mighty aura that struck Steve and the others with the pressure of a huge wave. "I apologize for being late, Mr. Sutton," the man boomed. Are you Faber Luther, one of the Lions Club's elders?" Steve had a wider network and knew a lot of people. One of the Lions Club's elders? The gloomy atmosphere suddenly seemed to be injected with vitality. The socialite's eyes lit up. The Lions Club was the largest martial arts club in Fawkes, and becoming a member there was a matter of pride for many. However, only normal members were usually seen. The elders were hardly ever sighted. Ignoring the pain and twisted expression on his face, Steve scurried over and stretched out his hand. "Nice to meet you, Elder Faber. My name is Steve Wagner. I was honored to meet you and President Yates at the last Fawkes Entrepreneurs and Celebrities Summit." The memory of that star-studded event was still vivid in his mind. Fawkes elites and wealthy had spared no effort to attend the summit, but only 20 attendees were selected. Steve had only been granted the chance because Sawyer Sinfield, the CEO of Mysticor Enterprise, had given him a free pass for Gordon's sake. He could never forget how Sawyer and the others tried to drink with President Yates, but the latter refused to drink a drop. In the end, Faber drank a glass on behalf of President Yates. The most astounding thing was, after drinking the wine, he gently squeezed the glass and instantly turned it into fine dust that drifted to the floor and away in the air. He was unbelievably, frighteningly powerful. Everyone thought of him as a god. Recalling how Faber had just shown up flying, Steve was even more convinced that Mrs. Sutton had fled because she was afraid of Faber. How could it possibly be because of Kiran? Faber remained expressionless in the face of Steve's self-introduction. He did not remember him at all and ignored him silently. "Gordon, Elder Faber's here. My sister can finally be saved." Instead of being offended, Steve shouted joyfully to Gordon. Gordon, aware of the Lions Club's influence, was also astonished by how Faber arrived. He nodded by way of greeting. "Elder Faber, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Although Gordon was the mayor, Faber did not care much for his status and said gravely, "During my training, I sensed unclean energy in this area, so I came." "You sensed it?" Steve exclaimed, even more awed. The socialite's eyes were starry with admiration. Kiran was also slightly startled. He had not expected Faber to have that sort of ability. "Gordon, hurry up and ask Elder Faber for help." Steve could not wait any longer. He was certain that Faber's intervention would save his sister. Right now, he was actually concerned about his sister's safety. It was not because of how close they were, though. As long as his sister was safe, he could continue to hang around Fawkes as Gordon's brother-in-law, attract rich women to sleep with him, and be spoilt with money. Gordon, his sister Natalie, to be exact, was his cash cow. Gordon was somewhat reluctant to plea with Faber when he had just managed to get Kiran's help. Worried that her father would change his mind, Ruth anxiously glanced at Kiran. "Mr. York, we're really grateful for your help." "Ruth, are you crazy?" "You still believe that punk?" Steve barked at her furiously. Faber frowned as well. He had rushed to their aid, only to be dismissed so humiliatingly. He darted a glance at Kiran. He was in his 20s, handsome and suave, and with a distinguished air. However, Kiran's calm and haughty demeanor and lack of reaction to Faber's scrutinizing gaze annoyed and surprised him at the same time. Faber's gaze was enough to scare a tiger, but Kiran was unexpectedly unfazed, which indicated that he was no ordinary youngster. "Can you subdue Mrs. Sutton?" Faber fixed him with a sharp and authoritative look. Kiran did not bat an eye. Instead of answering the question directly, he shifted his attention to the fleeing Mrs. Sutton and said, "You can't do it anyway!" Chapter 564. Outright dismissal. Kiran's remark shocked everyone. Steve was the first to snort out loud. Who was Kiran to look down on Elder Faber of the Lions Club? He leveled a cold stare at Kiran. "Are you blind? Didn't you see Elder Faber glide through the air just now?" He turned to Gordon and the others. At the last Fawkes Entrepreneurs and Celebrities Summit, Elder Faber crushed a wineglass into powder with just a gentle squeeze. Afraid that they could not visualize the scene, he took out his mobile phone and pretended it was the glass. Although its shape remained unchanged, his acting was rather true to life. He pursed his lips. "After such a display of strength, are you still going to believe this youngster instead of Elder Faber? Wow." Exclamations of wonder broke out among the socialites, and their eyes sparkled as they gazed at Faber. They looked like they wanted to strip naked, run up to him, and throw themselves at his feet. Women always favored strong men. Gordon and Ruth were just as astounded. However, Ruth told Kiran, "Mr. York, I only believe in you." She gripped her father's arm, secretly reminding him not to be misled by Steve. Ha ha. By then, Faber had recognized that Kiran was no ordinary young man, one not intimidated by him, at least, so he threw his head back and laughed. Indeed, there's talent in every generation. Today, I've finally seen for myself the arrogance of youth. Kiran smiled back at him without a word. "Elder Faber, we believe in you." Steve quickly piped up to express his support. However, Faber raised his hand to signal him to stop talking, before shifting his attention back to Kiran. Actions speak louder than words. With that, he slowly advanced toward Mrs. Sutton. Kiran's brow arched slightly in surprise. It seemed that Faber was a broad-minded man. He had expected Faber to fly into a rage and deride him, but the latter jumped straight into proving his strength, which was unusual. Kiran's impression of Faber significantly improved. Steve sneered at Kiran. "You should learn something about being noble-minded from Elder Faber." "Pfft!" The socialites made sounds of disdain and ridicule. Kiran ignored them and watched Faber. Faber slowly approached Mrs. Sutton. With every step, his aura intensified, causing the temperature around him to drop a few degrees. Kiran was astonished. Faber was powerful, even more so than Maxwell. He might be able to contend with Augustus. However, he was still no match for Mrs. Sutton, for she was under the control of a force far from normal. Steve and the others had no idea about that. They watched in anticipation and excitement as the air around Faber seemed to solidify under his command. They were full of hope that he could subdue Mrs. Sutton. When Mrs. Sutton saw Faber approaching, her expression wavered slightly, and she backed away. Steve whirled around to face Kiran triumphantly. "See? My sister was scared off by Elder Faber, not you." The socialites began to clap their hands enthusiastically. "Elder Faber, you're so strong. Elder Faber, everything is within your grasp. Elder Faber, you're the best in the world." It was the same groveling act they had used on Father Larson a moment ago. Just then, the air rippled and Mrs. Sutton moved. "Die, demon!" With a roar, Faber leaped up and lunged at her. Steve and the others waved their fists wildly, confident he could defeat her with one blow. "All hail Elder Faber! All hail Elder!" Boom! There was the sound of a collision, and Faber sailed backward, spurting a few mouthfuls of blood in the air. Bam! He crashed to the ground heavily, creating a deep pit. Steve and the lady's fists froze in the air. The battle was already over before they had even finished their battle cry. They stood there like clowns, dumbfounded and at a loss for how to react. There was a bright red palm print on Faber's chest. He tried to sit up, but his body felt like it was falling apart. Devoid of strength, he could only fall on his back and stare at the sky, lamenting inwardly. The night sky was dark, but not as dark as the misery in his heart. He never imagined that he would fail to withstand his opponent's blow. He had ruined his reputation and humiliated himself. "Mr. York, I believe you," Ruth cried out again, attracting everyone's attention. Steve opened his mouth to speak, but it fell open in silence. The others mirrored him too because Mrs. Sutton had started running again. This time, however, the person hot on her heels was Kiran. She darted to the east and then to the west, chased all over the place by Kiran like a stray mutt. How is Kiran doing that? This is impossible! How would a doctor know anything about occult art? Was he the one who scared Mrs. Sutton off? The socialites were all stunned, their faces full of astonishment and disbelief. When Mrs. Sutton had retreated and fled, they all thought it was because of Faber. Now that a single strike had severely wounded Faber, they realized that Kiran was the one Mrs. Sutton truly feared. The person they had refused to believe in, constantly belittled, and even called a loser, turned out to be the strongest. They had never believed in the supernatural, but now there was an evil spirit before their eyes, and it was Kiran himself. This was not human power. Faber and Father Larson recovered consciousness, only to be greeted by this mind-boggling scene. Father Larson was especially mortified when he recalled how he had ridiculed Kiran, only for him to lose an arm in the end. The latter, on the other hand, was dominating the scene like a glorious warlord. Father Larson was saddened to learn that, after all of his years of experience, there was still a yawning gap between him and Kiran. Mrs. Sutton shrieked as she ran. She was clearly enraged, but she did not dare to confront Kiran. Unlike Gordon and the others, Father Larson sensed a special energy within Kiran, and it was what seemed to be frightening the evil spirit possessing Mrs. Sutton. He could see it, but he did not understand why. Faber could feel Kiran's intense murderousness. Even he might succumb if he were to stand up to that murderous intent. It was too cold and overwhelming. "Kneel!" Kiran suddenly boomed, then began to mutter something under his breath. "Don't tell me he can cast spells too?" Steve, seething with resentment, taunted loudly when he heard Kiran order his sister to kneel. The next instant he was staggered to see his sister drop to her knees in front of Kiran. He rubbed his eyes to make sure he was not seeing things. Was Kiran a god? Steve's thoughts were the same as everyone else's. Kiran was indeed a god. Father Larson gaped at Kiran in amazement as if he had made a discovery. Kiran was using the esoteric exorcism method used by the flower girl. He appeared before Mrs. Sutton, raised his fist, and punched her square in the chest. "Ah!" Ruth screamed when she saw him hit her mother. Gordon's eyes widened. Mrs. Sutton flew toward the manor like a ball. Chapter 565. Like a shooting star, Kiran chased after Mrs. Sutton, while Gordon and the others swarmed toward them. Thump! Mrs. Sutton fell, but she quickly got up again to run away. Kiran had already caught up to her. He glared at her coldly and said, "Beast, come out now! Bam!" Kiran punched her in the chest again. Poof! Like popping a balloon, Mrs. Sutton's body turned into black mist. "Mom!" Ruth thought it was blood, so she cried out in fear. "You killed my sister!" Steve shouted angrily with a pale face. On the other hand, Gordon calmed down when he saw the black shadow in the air. The shadow looked short and had a round head. It was someone from Solara. The Solarian's shadow quickly condensed in the air to escape. "Shimada is lonely. He wants you to keep him company," Kiran said to the Solarian shadow who was about to escape. The shadow was shocked. It stopped in its tracks and looked at Kiran. "How do you know Shimada?" "I killed him," Kiran sneered. He could already sense that the shadow emitted the same energy as Shimada. "You killed Shimada," the black shadow roared angrily before exclaiming, "Impossible! There's no way. You're not a cultivating priest. Even if you were, you can't kill us." You're just amateurs." Kiran forcefully slapped him on the head. The black shadow instantly understood Kiran's method of killing, brute force. It was sheer force and violence, outrageous. The black shadow was in despair and deep rage. "The Solara medicine sect will get our revenge on you. Those who invade our country will be punished no matter what." Kiran interrupted him just like that. "Die!" Bam! There was a violent sound, and with a slap, the black shadow disappeared without a trace. Far away in Solara, someone spurted out blood again. Kiran's face was cold and strange. He grew vigilant after encountering dead bodies one after another, especially the Dragon Jade energy pit in Dragon's Mount. If the energy pit were destroyed, it would cause a serious problem. However, the York family's revenge was far less important than protecting the energy pit because he was from Dragon's Land. His country was his home. Kiran looked at the dark night sky and suddenly felt a huge sense of responsibility, like 1,000 pounds weighing on him. "Mom!" Ruth rushed forward, embracing her mother and shedding tears. "Don't worry, I'll heal her," Kiran assured her, carrying Mrs. Sutton into the villa. Gordon breathed a sigh of relief, his admiration for Kiran growing. Kiran was a miracle doctor. Unlike the careless Father Larson, Kiran was the real expert. Unlike Lions Club's Faber, Kiran was a god that was able to kill all spirits. In Gordon's eyes, Kiran had become a godlike figure that he looked up to and respected from the bottom of his heart. Upon entering the villa, Kiran saw that it was a mess. He put Mrs. Sutton on the bed and asked Ruth to tidy her up before he started the acupuncture treatment. Half an hour later, Kiran came out. Gordon and Ruth, who were waiting outside the whole time, quickly went up to him and asked anxiously, "How is she, Mr. Kiran?" "Let her rest for a bit. Take care of the things at home to lessen her psychological impact," said Kiran. Gordon praised him inwardly for how considerate he was. He nodded and held his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Kiran. Thank you, Mr. Sutton, as I said, virtue requires skills. Although you have a very nice estate, you can't afford to live here. I suggest you move out or fill up the pond and cut down the maple trees to prevent dark energy from accumulating," Kiran reminded him. "Don't worry, Mr. Kiran. I'll move out immediately and restore this place to its original state," Gordon quickly promised. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Sutton." With that, Kiran turned to leave. "Have some water." Ruth handed a bottle of mineral water to Kiran. After having the salty dishes Ruth made him that afternoon, he was indeed feeling thirsty, so he drank it. Ruth looked at him affectionately as if she were his wife, hoping that Kiran would accept her. Gordon could tell what his daughter was thinking. "Mr. Kiran, you saved my whole family. I don't know how else to repay you. How about I let Ruth take care of you?" Ruth's face turned red when she heard her father's words, but her eyes were full of anticipation. Over the years, her father had always wanted her to marry into a rich family, but she refused as she did not want to be used just for marriage. She did not expect him to let her marry Kiran, so she was over the moon. "Mr. Sutton, does your country allow bigamy?" Kiran asked seriously. "Bigamy?" Gordon asked. Then he realized that Kiran was already married. Ruth's eyes misted over with disappointment. Could Kiran already be married? Gordon's heart was filled with regret. He bowed to him and said, "Mr. Kiran, from now on I vow to protect you from any dangers that come your way. Anyone would have to first get through my dead body before they can hurt you." Kiran commended Gordon for his swift reaction. Swearing in front of his family and friends showed how sincere he was. Kiran smiled and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Sutton. You should take care of the current situation first. Remember not to be overconfident in the future," Kiran reminded. Gordon slapped himself shamefully. He looked at Father Larson and the others and said, "I was blind. I was deceived by a liar." Thud. Father Larson dropped to his knees before Kiran. Gordon initially planned to take care of Father Larson so he would not lie to others again, but he did not think he would kneel. Thud. Thud, thud. Father Larson hit his head on the ground. Mr. Kiran, would you accept me as your apprentice? Apprentice? Gordon bit his tongue to stop himself from speaking. Kiran did not think that he would ask to be his apprentice. He looked at Father Larson and thought that since he trained on Dragonfang Peak, he had potential. He may not be the best at studying, but with time he could cultivate his talent. Go get your arm back, Kiran ordered. Thank you, Master. Father Larson was ecstatic when he told him to retrieve his arm. That meant that he would heal him and take him in as his apprentice. Soon after retrieving his arm, Kiran performed acupuncture on him, suturing and reattaching his arm. Although it was a serious injury and recovery would take a long time, it was still salvageable. Father Larson took the opportunity to beg him to save the other bodyguards. Just as Kiran was about to agree, Steve emerged from the crowd. Chapter 566. Thump. Steve kneeled in front of Kiran. Mr. Kiran, help me please. Steve was no longer as arrogant as he was before. He was just worried that he was going to die. Gordon looked at his brother-in-law, wanting to slap him, but his face was already crooked. How could he slap him? He looked at Kiran and said, Mr. Kiran, punish him as you please. Don't worry about saving me, face. Kiran admired Gordon's open-mindedness and his willingness to punish his own family for their wrongdoings. Mr. Kiran, it's my fault for looking down on you. Please forgive me, Steve cried and begged. Seeing Steve admit his mistake, Kiran decided to let it slide. He smiled and said, Get up, I help you. Thank you, Mr. Kiran. Thank you. Steve was so moved that he cried. Kiran was repaying his wrongdoings with kindness. Kiran took out his silver needle to help him relieve the pain, set the bones, and fix Steve's deformed face. He told Ruth to get a pen and paper to write down the prescriptions for Mrs. Sutton and Steve so she could get someone to prepare the medication. Gordon was extremely grateful. The ladies were looking at Kiran as if they had stars in their eyes, admiring him to the extreme. However, their hearts went cold, seeing as Kiran did not fancy Ruth. Nonetheless, they still thought of ways to get involved with Kiran. Steve was already thinking of a gift he could give Kiran in return for his kindness. Once Kiran was done, Faber walked over and gave him a thumbs up. Sir, your skills are extraordinary. You're simply the best of the best, Kiran smiled. You're not too bad yourself. Although he did not have a good impression of Lions Club because of Felix, he liked Faber, who was rather arrogant but carried the air of a domineering martial artist. Faber stared at Kiran's face for more than 10 seconds and asked suddenly, Is your last name York? Kiran was taken aback. What did he mean by that? Faber asked anxiously. Are you from Bayville? Gordon and Ruth exchanged glances. They had not asked him where he came from. They met Kiran on the plane from Maui, so they assumed he was from there. Kiran smiled. Yes, I'm from Bayville. Faber's eyelids flew wide open as he stared at Kiran for another full minute. No wonder. Sigh. Faber had a sad look in his eyes. Kiran flinched. Lions Club. If there was a Wolf Gate and a Panther Gate, could there be a Lion Gate? Lions Club? Kiran smirked at Faber. The York family was wiped out 20 years ago, and I'm the only survivor, Kiran York. Gasp! Everyone inhaled sharply. Not many people knew about this, but the words wiped out shocked them. How cruel and terrifying. There was an unnatural expression on Faber's face, but he quickly regained his composure and nodded to Kiran. Goodbye. Kiran knew that he was hiding something, but he did not ask him about it and nodded back. Faber then left, and Kiran turned to Gordon. Gordon was unexpectedly calm. He looked at Ruth and said, Mr. Kiran is an important family friend. If he ever needs help from us in the future, we should do our best to help him. Ruth's face was filled with excitement when she heard that. Don't worry, Dad. She looked at Kiran determinedly. Kiran was stunned. Gordon had surpassed his expectations. When Kiran was talking about where he came from, he was actually saying it for Gordon to hear. After all, those who have different beliefs could not work together. Unexpectedly, Gordon actually knew about it, but he still treated him as family, which showed how trustworthy he was as a person. Take care, Mr. Sutton, Kiran addressed him politely. I believe you will avenge your family one day. Gordon showed him his support. Kiran nodded and said, I'll be leaving now. Farewell. Gordon looked at Ruth and said, Send Mr. Kiran off. Ruth nodded. This way, Mr. Kiran. Kiran bid farewell to Ruth and took Father Larson to Sawyer's home. Gordon looked at Kiran's back and then at Steve. Remember to be polite to Mr. Kiran in the future. Yes, Gordon. Steve knew that by politeness. He meant to treat him with the same respect he had treated his brother-in-law. After saving Gordon's family, he was willing to do anything for Kiran. With Kiran's power and abilities, it was worth the risk. When Kiran brought Father Larson to the villa, Shuri was reading on the sofa. She had obviously been anxious because Kiran was not there. In fact, she almost burst into tears when she came back and saw that Kiran was not there to take care of her godparents. She was ready to vent all her pent-up anger until she saw Kiran coming back with a priest covered in blood. She jumped up and said, "Are you okay?" Kiran nodded. "I'm fine." He pointed at Father Larson and said, "This is Father Larson. He'll be recuperating here and taking care of your godparents." On the way back, Kiran found out that Father Larson's name was literally Father Larson, so he had been calling him by his actual name all this while. "So can he really do it?" Shuri saw his broken arm. Father Larson's face turned red. He was a little ashamed. If he had not looked down on Kiran and followed his advice, he would not be in this state. "Don't worry about him." Kiran suddenly thought of Bianca asking him to work at Mysticor, so he said, "I'm going to work tomorrow." "Work?" Shuri was pleased to hear that she had someone to rely on. "You don't have to worry about me either. Someone will take care of it for me." Kiran was curious about Bianca's relationship with Felix. He wanted to see what Felix would be like. Shuri felt differently. How could someone give work to the chairman? How ironic. Just when she wanted to ask, Kiran's phone rang. He took his phone out and saw that it was Yvonne. He answered the phone and accidentally put it on speaker. Yvonne's sweet voice blasted from the other end. "Hubby, come pick me up from the airport." Chapter. Hubby. Shuri and Father Larson both looked at Kiran. What would this man's wife look like? Kiran's face turned cold. He asked Yvonne, "What are you doing here?" Shuri and Father Larson were shocked again. Was he not on good terms with his wife? Yvonne did not expect Kiran to talk to her like that, so she said embarrassedly, "I'm sorry. I'll take care of it myself." "Are you here already?" Kiran asked before she could hang up. "I just got off the plane." "I'll just take a taxi. You don't have to come pick me up." Yvonne sounded bitter. "Wait for me." Kiran hung up. Judging from his expression, Shuri thought that Kiran did not like his wife very much. Was it because she was ugly? "Do you have a car?" "Get me one," Kiran said to the dazed Shuri. "Take my godfather's car." Shuri jumped up in a panic and handed Kiran the key to an Audi. Kiran went out with a glum face and drove to the airport. It was not that he was being mean to Yvonne on purpose, but when he left, he told them not to come, yet she still did. The fact that she did not listen made him unhappy. Plus, he did not want to be romantically involved with her at all. Kiran drove to the airport. When he arrived, he saw Yvonne standing at the exit in a white coat with her hair flowing behind her. Her pale face was drained of all its color, and her beautiful eyes looked expectant, like a wife waiting for her husband to come home. Her unique outfit and beauty made her stand out from the crowd. For some reason, the sight of Yvonne warmed up the coldness in Kiran's heart. She was a girl with a cruel fate. Thinking of all the pain she had gone through, Kiran felt even more sympathy for her. Kiran drove over and saw several young men and women walking toward her. He parked the car, wondering what the youngsters were trying to do. "Hey, beautiful. Are you alone?" said one of the men with a middle parting, dressed in casual clothes. His other friends kept looking at Yvonne up and down. Attracted by Yvonne's morbid beauty, the men's eyes showed greed. They wanted to hold her in their arms and protect her. On the other hand, the women's eyes showed envy toward Yvonne's unique aura as she was leagues above them. Yvonne may have seemed docile and even selfless in front of Kiran, but in front of others, she was arrogant and strong. She simply ignored those people. "All alone and wearing so many clothes, you must be cold." "Why don't you come into my warm embrace?" the leader of the group said with a lustful expression. "Go away," Yvonne said in a cold and annoyed tone. The women curled their lips and sneered at her. "Not everyone can get into Mr. Sherman's arms. Many people want to be with him but aren't good enough. Mr. Sherman came up here out of concern because he saw you standing here alone." "Don't be ungrateful." Sherman looked at Yvonne satisfiedly. She was wearing a pure white jacket, black flared pants, and sneakers. She looked innocent and beautiful. The red bracelet on her wrist did not look expensive, but it added to her charm. Yvonne's natural beauty made Sherman's eyes sparkle. How thrilling. She was as beautiful as a goddess. Sherman was racking his brain, thinking of words to describe her. After hearing Kiran's cold tone, Yvonne was already in a bad mood, but with these pests harassing her, she became furious. Thus, she lifted her hands to use black magic on them. When Kiran saw, he was worried that she would cause a scene that would drag Gordon down for his poor management. "Beep, beep." He honked his car twice. Rolling down the window, he drove over. Yvonne smiled beautifully when she saw him, looking like a blooming lotus flower. Sherman and the others were dumbfounded, as if they were looking at a fairy. "Get in," Kiran shouted. "Thanks, hubby." Yvonne seemed to have forgotten his attitude earlier. Smiling brightly, she opened the car door to get in. When Sherman saw that the beautiful Yvonne was leaving, he impulsively said to Kiran, "I can't believe you have the guts to pick her up in a rundown Audi." Then, he smiled at Yvonne. "Beautiful, I drive a Maybach sports car. Why don't you ride with me?" "Wow." One of the women gasped. No woman has ever sat in Mr. Sherman's Maybach. This is a first. I want to ride in it. I'm so jealous. The women exclaimed, full of jealousy and hatred, fueling Sherman's ego. He glanced sideways at Kiran smugly, certain that Yvonne would be enamored with vanity. What good was love anyway? It was not like they could spend or eat love. He did not believe that any woman would resist his wealth. Even if she were a chaste and virtuous woman, he was confident that he could use money to pry her legs open. His eyes turned to look at Yvonne, awaiting her response. Yvonne's eyes betrayed a look of contempt, and she looked at Kiran with a smile. Hubby, if you call me wifey, I'd rather happily ride a bicycle than cry in a Maybach. Sherman, who was full of confidence earlier, suddenly felt like he was doused with a bucket of cold water. She had no interest in him at all, which was humiliating. The worst part was that she was even begging Kiran to call her his wife. One word from him was worth more than riding in his Maybach sports car. Insane. What was going on? Was she crazy? He looked at Kiran's handsome face and branded outfit. Could he be from a wealthy family? Kiran looked at Sherman. He looked like Ted, but he was physically bigger and looked like he could put up a fight. He then thought of William Sherman. Could that be his son? However, that was not important now. He said to Yvonne, "Get in the car and let's go." "Okay, hubby." Yvonne lost the coldness she had when facing those men earlier. Now she was a docile little sheep. She opened the door and got in the car with a face full of happiness. Sherman was so angry that he was about to explode. "Damn it, I'll smash your car." "Mr. Sherman, there are beer bottles over there," one of the girls shouted and ran toward the tail of Kiran's car. Sherman ran over to pick up the bottle, too. Just as he was about to throw it at his car, he saw the car plate and stood there blankly without moving a muscle. Chapter. The car plate ended with 99,999. The price of this Audi was less than $1 million, but this car plate cost at least tens of millions. Mr. Sherman thought that his Maybach was awesome, but suddenly he felt that his sports car was nothing but crap. It was not just about money, it was about power. Having a car plate like this did not just require money but connections. The woman saw the car plate too, but she curled her lips and said, "Damn it! So what if he has a nice car plate? It can't compete with Mr. Sherman's Maybach." Slam! Mr. Sherman threw the glass bottle on the floor and growled at her, "Shut the fuck up!" The woman shivered in fright, looking at the shattered glass. She realized that he was angry. Without a word, Mr. Sherman walked to his car. He was not afraid of the car plate, but the car itself. This was his Uncle Sawyer's car. As William's son and Sawyer's nephew, of course, he recognized the car. He remembered how Ted was beaten up by Kiran today, so he dared not act rashly. His friends did not know about it. They just thought that he was angry, so they also went back to their respective cars. Kiran was already on his way back to the city. "How did you get such a luxurious car when you just got here?" Yvonne sat in the car with a happy smile on her face. "Just say what you want to say." Kiran was lukewarm. "You smell like women's perfume. All from women I don't know, and it seems like there's more than one scent." Yvonne sniffed the air and smiled. Her beautiful eyes showed hope that Kiran would have relationships with other women. Kiran remembered that he had carried both Ruth and Shuri, and he had not showered yet, so that made sense. "Are you staying silent out of guilt?" Yvonne smiled at him. Guilty about what? Even if Snow was here, she wouldn't care about it. Kiran was calm. "Since she doesn't care, why don't you love me too?" Yvonne seized the opportunity. "Why are you here?" Kiran changed the subject, ignoring her. "I feel lost without you, so I came here." Yvonne looked out at the night sky calmly. "It seems like you're my everything now." "Didn't you say you wanted to go to the Ludwig's house to find out more about Power Hub?" Kiran asked. "I wanted to, but I don't know if it's necessary. Most importantly, I don't know what my place in your heart is. I hope it's not just my wishful thinking. There will never be a future with us together, so don't waste your effort." "I don't want to owe you anything." Kiran looked straight ahead. Kiran sounded as cold as when he picked up the phone. Yvonne smiled sadly, but she simply looked out without saying anything. The car fell silent. She missed the moment she was held in Kiran's arms in Maui. She wanted to live in that moment forever. When Kiran got back to the villa, Yvonne was surprised at how huge and luxurious it was. She joked, "Did you hook up with a rich girl?" "It's Aurora's home," Kiran said helplessly. "She's a rich girl too?" Yvonne sighed in relief. It seemed like the tension from their previous conversation had disappeared. She opened the door and got out of the car. When Shuri heard the car coming back, she walked out, wanting to see what Kiran's wife looked like. When she saw Yvonne getting out of the car in her jacket, she was shocked. She looked at Yvonne's small face, almond-shaped eyes, long eyelashes, straight nose bridge, and cherry lips. She was the definition of beauty. She was beautiful indeed. Shuri thought that she was beautiful, but Yvonne was on a different level. However, why was she dressed in a down jacket? That did not make sense. She quickly looked at Kiran. Did Kiran not like her because she was ill? Yvonne had already noticed Shuri. She smiled and greeted her. Hello, I'm Yvonne, Kiran's wife. When Shuri saw her taking the initiative to say hello, she put aside her curiosity and responded, Hello, I'm Shuri, Aurora's sister. Your sister is very cute. I've met her before. Yvonne closed the distance between them, but Kiran was already walking inside. Wait for me, Yvonne shouted childishly and followed him in. Shuri looked at the both of them, feeling something off between this married couple. There was zero communication. Kiran entered the living room. Father Larson had already sensibly entered his room too. Kiran turned to look at Shuri. Give her a room to stay in. Can't she stay in your room? Shuri asked nicely. Of course, Yvonne agreed readily. Kiran glared at her. Yvonne deliberately flirted with him and said, I know I can't have children because of my poor health, but you can't treat me like this. Shuri widened her eyes at Kiran. It was because she could not have children. How could he be so mean to his wife? This man was being too much. The fact that this man did not even bother helping her when she was being beaten up showed how cruel he was. Shuri despised him deep down. Kiran was left speechless by Yvonne's joke. He looked at Shuri and asked, Does William have a son? Shuri quickly nodded. Yes. His name is Joel Sherman. He has been practicing martial arts in Lions Club since he was a child so he can fight. Was that Mr. Sherman guy earlier, Joel? Yvonne asked Kiran. Did you see him? Shuri looked worried. Walter wanted to take revenge on Kiran for beating Ted up today, but she had not told him yet. If he gets into trouble with William's son as well, he would be in huge trouble. Yvonne explained what had happened at the airport earlier. Shuri confirmed, Yes, that's him. Yvonne looked at Kiran and teased, If I knew he was this powerful, I would have just slept with him. Why did I even try to save you from embarrassment? Shuri was speechless. Was Kiran's wife always this shameless? Kiran did not know what to do with her anymore. Yvonne was so desperate to be with him that she was even starting to lose her dignity. He did not know how to get along with this woman now, so he took his shirt off and said, I'm going to take a shower. He walked into the bathroom, ignoring Shuri's misunderstanding and Yvonne's antics. Shuri was left feeling awkward. After telling Yvonne where Kiran's room was, she went upstairs. Yvonne looked at the bathroom and smirked before running into the room where Sawyer and the others were lying unconscious. Chapter 569. When Yvonne entered the room, her face turned solemn. She checked on the three of them and fell into deep thought. How could Sawyer be the source of the love spell? Yvonne never imagined that such a strange phenomenon could happen. She really did want to go to the Ludwig family instead of coming to Fox. But her interaction with Kiran made her realize that the source of the love spell was here, so she immediately came. When she met Kiran, she deliberately acted childish and flirtatious to annoy him and distract him. Her goal was to drive him away so she could find out about the source of the love spell. She did not think that Sawyer was the source. Did Fiona make that love spell? If she did, that meant that she had cultivated this dual female love spell even before the York family was wiped out. If that was the case, the love spell was not intended for her and Kiran, but for Kiran's father. Yvonne was shocked by the possibility of that. Just how attractive was Titus York? Yvonne sat there without moving. She could not figure out the reason. After coming out of the shower, Kiran went to look for Yvonne. She was nowhere to be found, so he went up to see how Sawyer was doing instead, and there she was, sitting in a daze. What's wrong? Did you find out anything? He was not surprised to see her there. Yvonne nodded. I found something. What is it? Kiran asked excitedly. Yvonne just stared at Sawyer without saying anything. Can you get rid of the poison? Kiran could not wait. Resuscitating him by sheer force was his last resort. It was better to use black magic to remove the poison. Didn't you already help solve the problem? Yvonne asked Kiran. My blood can help them breathe normally, but it can't revive them. Kiran looked at her and continued, If you have a way, please help treat them. Yvonne looked up at him. If you can't do it, what makes you think I can? Are you making things difficult for me on purpose? Kiran saw through her intentions. Yes, I just want your love. If you say yes, I'll tell you more. Go to sleep. Kiran refused and went out. In the living room, he lay down on the sofa and slept, leaving Yvonne alone. Yvonne was left there like an abandoned child. It was even worse than being thrown into an ice cellar. She clenched her fists and looked at the door angrily. How am I inferior to Snow? She looked at Sawyer. If no one is willing to help these people, so be it. Yvonne went downstairs and saw Kiran sleeping on the sofa without going into his room just because he did not want to be with her. She was even more furious now, so she stormed out of the villa. Kiran did not expect her to leave. He sat up and hesitated for a moment before following her out. In the house, Shuri watched the two of them, completely unable to understand their relationship. At the entrance, Yvonne got into a taxi, and Kiran followed her in too. She looked out the window without a word, pretending not to recognize Kiran. To Fox Hill. After saying that, Kiran looked out the other window. The driver saw the two of them dressed luxuriously like they were from wealthy families, but they seemed to be quarreling. He could not help but say, "I didn't think rich people like both of you could be so unhappy." Kiran retracted his thoughts and asked, "Why do you say that? From this villa to a villa in Fox Hill, it shows that you're just getting richer and richer. Despite that, you seem to be having a lot of trouble, which is why I said you don't look happy." Kiran was stunned to hear that. Life is short. Determination will give you direction, but being stubborn will only hold you back and bring you more trouble. The driver looked at them through the rearview mirror. Stubborn! Kiran felt enlightened after hearing his words, but also a little confused. Yvonne, who had been looking out the window all this time, suddenly turned her head and leaned into Kiran's arms. "Hubby, too love you." Wah. She did not care that she was in a taxi. She hugged Kiran and started crying. Kiran looked at Yvonne's cascading black hair while complicated emotions surged in him. His cold heart melted, and he hugged her without saying a word. When a couple gets into an argument, all they have to do is have sex. After having sex and taking a good nap, won't everything be better? The driver winked at Kiran as if to say, "You have such a beautiful wife. Aren't you a fool for not treating her well?" Kiran simply smiled as a response to his words. The driver was talkative. He kept giving Kiran advice along the way. Yvonne just lay in his arms. She was crying at first, but she gradually fell asleep. Kiran barely responded to the taxi driver. With Yvonne in his arms, he just thought about the future. It was impossible to cut off this love spell. He was now trapped with a knot in his heart. Snow had his whole heart, and he only loved her. The driver sent them both to Fox Hill. When the car stopped, he did not forget to reiterate, "Have sex, have a good night's sleep, and the issue will be gone." Ha ha ha. Yvonne shyly and expectantly lay in Kiran's arms without getting up. Kiran paid him and carried her to the gate. The security guards grew cautious when they saw Kiran arriving in a taxi. In a neighborhood where everyone was a billionaire with their own cars, Kiran's arrival in a taxi was a clear indication that he didn't live there. He may be handsome and well-dressed, but it was the middle of the night, so they still looked at him vigilantly. Kiran ignored the guards and walked toward the entrance. They were not happy to see him walking in so arrogantly. "Hey, what are you doing?" "What am I doing?" Kiran asked coldly in an upset tone. The security guard was angered by his response. "We're asking you what you're doing here. Don't you understand?" When Yvonne heard them argue, she looked up at Kiran flirtatiously with a sense of warning. The security guards saw Yvonne's pretty face, and their hearts leaped. How beautiful. Kiran did not want to argue with them, so he hugged Yvonne tightly and continued walking. After being ignored, the guards angrily said, "Miss, would you like us to call the police?" Chapter: Call the police. Kiran did not look pleased. How did he encounter such an idiotic security guard? The residents were usually the ones to approach the guard when they had issues entering the place. However, not only did this guard approach them first, but he even confronted them. Yvonne wanted to quickly go back with Kiran at first, but when she heard the guard say that, she felt playful all of a sudden. "Yes! Can you help us call the police, please?" "Of course." Mesmerized, the security guard did not even realize that Yvonne said us. "Help us make a police report." "Yes, ma'am." The security guard agreed excitedly and stared at Kiran. He was already beginning to imagine himself as the hero saving the damsel in distress. When he picked up the call, he thought of a crucial problem. What should I tell them? What to tell them? Yvonne looked thoughtful. She suppressed her laughter and said resentfully, "Just say that my husband and I aren't on good terms. He doesn't kiss me, doesn't sleep with me, doesn't." "Feft!" Yvonne burst out laughing at the end. Realizing he had been tricked, the security guard was left speechless. He wanted to get angry at Yvonne, but he could not do it to her beautiful face, so he directed their anger toward Kiran. He shouted, "What are you doing in Fox Hill Villa?" Kiran was originally mad at the two security guards, but seeing as they fell for Yvonne's trick, he was no longer mad. He took out his access card and shook it in their faces. "To go home!" When the security guards saw the access card studded with black diamonds, he immediately straightened his back. The contempt on his face was replaced with respect. "Welcome home, sir." Kiran nodded and was about to carry Yvonne in. "Liam Garcia, what are you doing?" Just then, a chubby security guard came over. Although he was in uniform, it was loosely fitted. His belly was bulging out and his hat was crooked. "Hello, Chief Duncan?" The two security guards stepped forward and greeted him respectfully. Duncan looked at Kiran and Yvonne. He was unfazed by Kiran's dashing looks, but the sight of Yvonne made his eyes sparkle as if he had discovered a whole new world. Yvonne had a thin figure, and her unique outfit was particularly eye-catching. Kiran could not be bothered by the so-called chief, so he simply walked over to swipe his card. "Hey, who are you?" Duncan was annoyed at Kiran for ignoring him. "Chief, they're residents." Liam quickly went up to introduce them. "Residents?" Duncan muttered, squinting at Kiran and Yvonne. "Then," he said to Liam, "are your eyes at the back of your head?" The two of them remained silent. They stood as straight as a pole, looking at Duncan. Duncan said smugly, "Haven't you seen A World with Thieves?" The two guards looked at each other. Why did that movie title sound so strange? Liam then realized the problem, so he whispered to him, "It's A World Without Thieves, bam!" Duncan kicked him. "Don't you think I'd know the name of the movie?" Liam could only smile and nod after getting kicked. "I'm trying to tell you that they're thieves." Duncan looked at Kiran and Yvonne proudly with a sneer in his eyes. He imagined himself an excellent detective solving a major case. Kiran's anger was ignited again. He just wanted to go to bed. Why must they start so much trouble? "They have access cards," Liam reminded softly, worried that Duncan might misunderstand. "Do you know that access cards can be stolen or counterfeited?" Duncan scolded, firmly believing that Kiran and Yvonne were thieves. Liam could not understand him, so he simply dared not speak. Duncan looked at Kiran and said, "Show me your access card."